Greetings, this is Griff Ruby, and the topic for this discussion is precedents. Now, precedents exist where a situation occurs that may occur again, or at least something kind of similar, sufficiently similar that the two situations, though typically not absolutely identical, would at least be sufficiently similar to be truly analogous to each other. You could compare one to the other. And what that allows you to do is you don't have to rethink every situation, totally reinventing the wheel every single time some situation arises. You can realize, oh, this is similar to what happened back in umpity-ump year, way back when, and we can handle this, we can understand this similarly, we can respond to it similarly. We can compare our present situation to that, and maybe even make a few contrasts where maybe something does have to be a little bit different. And if something does need to be different, we can compare the two situations and see what is different and why, and what different response that could merit. So all of that is meant to serve as precedent. It's also a matter of justice and fairness. If a specific situation is dealt with in a certain way, the next time it's met up with, you should deal with it in a similar way. Like if somebody committed a murder way back when and the punishment was thus and so, and then years and years go by and then another murder happened by somebody else, but the situation is similar, you don't have to rethink, well, what are we going to do? You should be, well, the last time we did this. Well, is this similar enough? Yes, it is. Well, then this time we're going to do the same thing, see? So precedents allow us to know what we should do based on what was done the first time we met up with a situation, or maybe even the first couple of times, because sometimes we may kind of learn from it a little, and we hopefully do a little better the next time. But it's all instructional, and we work our situation through. And the other thing is the situations in the past, our theologians have had a chance to pore over it all and see what was done, and and decide, was this really the right way to have handled it, and so on. So precedents are very important. And to our situation with the church today, there are, of course, a good many precedents that have application, such as the Arian crisis, such as the First Great Western Schism, such as the lengthy papal vacancy, such as the Old Catholic Community Council. There's a whole host of different kinds of precedents, and any number of lesser situations where clerics have rivaled clerics, even where sometimes both were legitimate. Nestorius bishop, that's another precedent. There's a lot of different precedents, but the one precedent I'm going to focus on here is the one that took place in England in the 1500s, because in 1534 you have a situation in which the king wanted all the clergy to sign this thing called the Declaration of Royal Supremacy. I'm sure that most of them just kind of thought this was some political whatever it was, so they went wherever, they signed this piece of paper, and they went back thinking, okay, it's business as usual, not realizing, no, they've just traded, they've just obtained a king instead of a pope. The king is now their pope, and they're no longer subject to the pope. Well, that's in the fine print somewhere, but most people, they don't really read things carefully, and that's how it was. I could talk about that, and maybe I will one day too, that people don't always really read something and take in what it says. It's like, oh, I don't believe he really said what he just said, kind of thing. So I'll just act like he didn't say it. You say people get like that. So they sign this piece of paper, not realizing that they've just threw over the Pope and decided to take the king as their Pope. So some may have figured that out, but they were afraid. They couldn't do anything else. They were going to die. And of course, you've got the bishop, St. John Fisher, and some handful of priests who didn't sign it, but they, of course, were either removed, sent to the Tower, driven underground, and of course, in all cases, quickly replaced with others who were perfectly happy to sign this thing. So by and large, you had the same people in the same cathedrals and parish churches, the same seeming relationships and so forth, but because it was all under the different auspices, the power of God was gone. And so next comes all the aberrations, the heresies, the liturgical disintegration, and so forth. And that's, for example, Michael Davies had done a very good job of documenting in great detail in his Cranmer's Godly Order book. So you see a lot of parallels there, which of course serve specifically to draw attention to the similarities, to the connection between that time and ours. because you've got altars turned into tables and turned around. You've got the priest suddenly saying everything aloud and maybe not necessarily being concerned with whether he's even ordained or what that even means, if anything. The Eucharist in the hand and given in both kinds. And again, no serious commitment to a valid one, sacramentally speaking. All this kind of stuff, breaking up of altars and so forth, destroying images, taking out, some of the feasts from the calendar. All these things were being done, and of course the persecution of the monasteries, by which a bunch of fat cats enriched themselves by saying, "Oh, all the monasteries are corrupt," and even if some might possibly have been, I'm not even sure of that. That's no excuse to go denuding all of them and making certain people very, very rich. And of course, the king got his percentage of all that as well, which is why he allowed it. So, and all that just, even though the king didn't want to change anything, except he just wanted to be able to say he wasn't married to Catherine Aragon, so he could marry somebody else. That's all he wanted. As far as he was concerned, let everything else stay the same. He wasn't part of the Luther Revolution, or Zwingli and Calvin and all the other stuff that was going on the European continent. He even wrote that essay as a king, for which he got called the defender of the faith. He didn't want to corrupt anything. He just wanted to be able to remarry. That's all he wanted. And so, at first things didn't change, but quickly they did, because of course all those other interests come rushing in. When you lose the power of God, everybody starts getting a piece of the pie, and they want something for themselves. And they want it to be like this, and they want it to be like that. And of course, everybody wants it to be easier than it used to be. So we have that precedent. And I think an important aspect of that precedent is the most tragic aspect of all, that because you had the same priests and bishops in the same parish churches and cathedrals, you had a lot of people going to the same church their family had gone to for generations, maybe even a millennia or more. And instead of being able to rely upon the guidance and so forth they received, they instead were being deceived and led into a false new religion, bit by bit, gradually, and so forth, as the new Anglican religion gradually took form with its different liturgies and teachings, replacing Thomas Aquinas with Richard Hooker and all this kind of stuff. So it kind of went downhill after that detachment. That, of course, so well mirrors and explains our situation, because you have the Roman schism happening first, in the way that you could be, being a Catholic and being part of the Vatican apparatus are two separate things, that one does not imply the other. And that you had that, of course, created with Lumen Gentium. It's basically the 20th century declaration of royal supremacy is what it was. So having created that situation, it was only a matter of time before a surprisingly similar set of all the usual aberrations developed there. The same liturgical ones I just mentioned, the same doctrinal ones. It all did the same thing, because it's exactly the same kind of problem. It's a schism. You lose the power of God, and all these other interests rush in. Selfish interests of this person wants this, and that person wants this. Oh, Latin is hard, so I want a vernacular, but of course I want my vernacular. Somebody else is going to want his, and the next person is going to want theirs. And oh, we have these other little local customs. We like to sacrifice chickens here, and over there you got Santeria, and you got Saint Death, and the Novus Ordo is full of all this same kind of crazy stuff. Just like the Anglican has its high church, its low church, its broad church, its liberals, its conservatives, its thises and that's. That's just, there's no cohesive set of belief there, and there's no cohesive set of belief with the Novus Ordo either. So it's a very important precedent, and it tells us a lot about our situation. But the tragic part, of course, is what about all those poor Englanders who went to the very people they should have been able to trust, and instead of being taught the religion God wanted to teach them, they were taught something else? Can we hope that God was merciful in those cases? Well, perhaps, especially if they were suspicious of the changes or didn't respond well to them, or just would not avail themselves of these new liberties they were being granted or something. There's probably room for for hope that maybe some people will experience God's mercy. But the fact remains that you had enough of the population who cared so little about their religion that they really didn't complain enough when it was taken away from them. And that was then, and it's the same thing again now, obviously. So how could God allow a thing like that? I mean, it's like, how did he allow that? Well, by that same token, how could God allow the American continents to be in, religious darkness for 1,450 years? So that's a long time. So mercy is is a mystery, and some of these things are just a mystery. And so forth. But we have to assume that there was some reason that God allowed this. To a large degree, it has a lot to do with people just not being ready to do what they're supposed to do or willing to do what they're supposed to do. I mean, who knows, but perhaps some person was told, round up some missionaries and get in a ship and sail west across the ocean, and they just didn't do it. Who knows what might have happened, but that's lost to history and we'll never know, at least in this life. So we don't know all of what happens, but of course a lot of it is really human guilt. We bring our judgment upon ourselves, and it's only God's mercy that can forgive us and that can lift us out of all those sins. So if that kind of mercy, also does one other thing, it draws good out of the evil. The fall of England was a terrible, tragic thing. It really was. But out of that terrible evil that was more or less bound to happen no matter what else happened, because like I said, the people were just not taking it seriously. They were treating their religion as being on par with manners, as if cheating on your wife is the same thing as using the wrong fork or not holding it correctly at the dinner table. It was kind of like that. You did the right thing not because you had a supernatural reason to believe there's God watching you and wanting you to do the right thing, but merely because, well, this is the polite thing to do. This is just what we do, We eat this way and we live this way, and it's just what's accepted. It's a norm. And if it were a norm to do something evil or disgusting, then that too is a norm, and, it would be impolite not to do that either. So you have this kind of situation that arises. And so, you can kind of understand where it might be like a sort of judgment that God brought upon a nation, that he would allow them to fall into ignorance and darkness even after they'd enjoyed the light of the gospel for how long. So that happened in England then. That happens all around the world now. And that's basically Vatican II all over again. Or Vatican II, Vatican II is the English system all over again. So with all those similarities, though, there's another thing we learn from that from then from now till the end. Are we in the end times? I don't think so. Okay, I could be wrong. I would be happy to be wrong. But my own personal, subjective, gut feeling guess, call it what you like, is the end is not yet. Assuming that to be the case, that means things will be around long enough. There will one day be a restoration. There will one day be a pope. There will one day be a triumph of the Immaculate Heart. That could be decades, possibly even centuries down the pike. I don't know when. I don't have a calendar for you on that one. But that this stuff will all come back. There will be a real restoration of the church and faith and so forth. One probably so miraculous that people will have to be impressed by it. But that's all way in the future somewhere. But we do know, we have the prophecy that says at the end, nevertheless, there's this huge apostasy. And I can tell you right now, I really do believe that so much of what we're going through right now is evil, it's horrible, it's a terrible judgment brought upon a planet full of people who would rather watch football than sit in church, that the precedents from this time will be very, very useful when that end time comes. So there's prophecies that talk about that, and I'm just going to hastily summarize some of them. They would talk about bishops against bishops and altars against altars, and false churches where the lamp is out, is extinguished, and maybe even suggestions of false popes and so forth. And well, there is the Antichrist of biblical prophecy, who's could very easily be a false pope working with the Antichrist himself of biblical prophecy to set up a false church. So, I mean, you have all this kind of stuff. And if we are in the end times, the false Babylon the Great of biblical prophecy was born in 1954. But like I said, I don't think this is the end yet, and we have no information as to whether the Novus Ordo will endure to the end of time. If it does, then Babylon the Great was born at this time. But if not, it will have risen whatever future events bring that about. So, what will that be? How can our time be a precedent, though, if we don't have a pope now, but apparently there's going to be a pope then? Well, here's something to think about. Yes, obviously, there's every belief that there should be a pope and would be one again, and presumably even when in the time of Antichrist. But there's also prophecies that say things like the pope would have much to suffer at the hands of Antichrist. This to me suggests that the pope does not have the freedom to move about. Antichrist has him, has captured him, holds him, cages him somewhere, can keep him out of communication with the church, or far worse. And this is what I think is going to happen. My guess, but going on a limb here, this is what I think is going to happen when that time comes. He'll allow some communication between the Pope and the church, but it'll always be edited, filtered, processed through Antichrist minions. So the Pope is not going to know for sure what's going on in the church. He might hear a report, oh, Bishop so-and-so is making a trouble, and it might not be that bishop. It might be a different one. It might be a total fabrication. It might even be that bishop's not making trouble, but just really working a lot of miracles and spreading the gospel. The Pope isn't going to get, a trustworthy report. So he's not going to be able to make a very relevant decision. Correspondingly, the Pope could just try to decide a case, or whether something is heresy, and maybe invoking his infallibility. But unfortunately, what he has to say is going to, again, be filtered through Antichrist minions, so we have no way of knowing if the Pope really said this or that or not. At most, we would probably just be able to see the Pope, say, making references to recent historical events to show that he's still alive. And we can maybe see if he looks like he's holding up or not under the pressure, or how well and how he's doing. Just enough to say, okay, he's still there, he's still alive, we'll say our masses in union with him, but obviously we don't have any realistic, practical communication with him. What that's going to mean is several things. One is our bishops are going to have to make a lot of their own decisions. Oh, we've got 3 candidates here, we're thinking we'd like to have be the next bishop for this particular flock over here. Normally you'd ask the Pope to say, yeah, I'll take this one or that one, or send me some more, whatever the Pope may say. We can't reliably do that. We the bishops are just going to have to make this decision on our own authority. Well, that's today. The only difference is the lack of access to a Pope isn't that he's being held incommunicado by Antichrist, but simply that there isn't one. But you see, the effect is the same. The bishops will have to make their own decisions about a lot of things. And other things, not just who, but even things like where and how and what flocks and how to allocate stuff. You got to remember, the apostasy is the departure of Catholics. You can't say, well, nations are going to be, that already happened 100 years ago. I mean, what do you think World War I was all about? It was about, the non-Catholic nations have won out against the Catholic nations who withered and declined, and now there are no Catholic nations left. So, that's not the great apostasy. The great apostasy is that you have a huge number of Catholics who get deceived by Antichrist, by the false prophet, by all those minions of Antichrist, the media, and so forth, and whatever else may come to exist in that time. They're deceived. You see, that's going to include laity, religious, priests, bishops. Suddenly, in some stretch of land where you had 500 dioceses with 500 bishops, you now have 5 or 10 faithful bishops, and everybody else, presiding over a very tiny percentage of those who are staying loyal. Obviously, those 5 bishops are not going to combine their ministries to their own particular little former dioceses. They're going to need to work these things out among themselves and figure out how to allocate who's going to be in whose flock and who's going to be responsible for who. They're going to have to do this stuff, and they're not going to be able to, hey, Holy Father, we have the situation here. Can you delegate us, who's going to have what flock? Because there's no reliable communication again. So you can see our situation today despite the difference that we don't have a pope and then there will be, nevertheless can provide quite a number of very important and useful precedents for when the time comes. We see something else too, the lawfulness of it. I think Antichrist will find some way to make it look like it was a direct legal succession of the church. But there'll be some technicality that shows that it's not. And I don't think it would be the same technicality, but it'd be something. This time, that's exactly what we had here, or even back in England. It looked the same buildings, the same people. You see, the technicality was they signed the Declaration of Royal Supremacy. In our day, the technicality is that this society redefined itself as something other than the church by describing that church as merely as not itself, but merely as some other society that, some portions of which would happen to subsist within some portions of their society, which could be 5 people, or whatever. Who knows? It could be whatever. And probably, at first it might be everybody, but, non-Catholics would enter, or a person's presence would go from being Catholics to non-Catholics, and real Catholics would be more and more obliged to leave, but some might be permitted to stay in certain localized circumstances. You see, and that's exactly what's happened. So I think we can reasonably assume there'll be things like that. So as you can see, the evil of our present day will nevertheless provide a number of very helpful precedents for when the end really does come. Anyway, that's what I have to say about precedents. Thank you.